one of the persistent questions troubling policymakers, or those policymakers that continue to care about working people in this country anyway, is why is it, with what appears to be a full employment recovery, wages are still so sluggish and so many people are struggling to see income growth. Our next guest is an economist who has co-authored what I think is a very significant paper on that topic. Marshall Steinbaum is the research director and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute in New York City, and he has recently written a paper on, as I say, co-authored a paper on labor market concentration, and we talk about that. He joins us now. First of all, Marshall, thanks for coming on the program.
Very glad to be back on the program.
And we're glad to have you back. Now, am I overstating? Well, probably modesty forbids you from answering, but I really think this is such an important issue, the stagnation of wages, and basically what I felt you and your co-authors were pointing to was the nature of the labor market in so many areas of this country makes it very hard, even with what seems like full employment, for demand to go up in a way that allows people's wages to get stronger. First of all, did I state that correctly from your point of view? And secondly, we can talk about why that is.
Yeah, I think you did state it correctly. The issue that we uncovered is essentially that there are too few employers, or at least too few employers posting jobs in a large variety of occupations and more or less all over the country. And that has a significant impact on reducing wages. So it may be the case that there are employers who have current employees who work in the occupation in which you're looking for a job, but those employers aren't posting vacancies and hiring new workers as frequently, if at all, and consequently, employers have market power. We interpret they have market power in the labor market, and this enables them to reduce wages.
And so, just to be clear, we're not talking about a lack of jobs. There could be a good number of jobs, but if they are predominantly with one employer, there's nobody else competing with that employer for those employees, so they can offer them at low wages, and in effect, people have no alternative, right?
Yes, that is exactly the issue. The issue is that if there are job openings, they are concentrated at one or a very few employers. And this is, I mean, you said that this is a significant paper, and to my mind, it's sort of surprising that the paper was not written before we got to it. To some degree, that's because it's a little bit hard to get access to data sets in which you can see both vacancies being posted by employers and also who applies to those vacancies. But more to the point, I think that the people who have devoted themselves to attempting to answer the question that you posed at the beginning, why haven't wages increased as much even as the unemployment rate has gone down since the Great Recession, have more or less been looking at worker characteristics almost exclusively. So they would be I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, please continue. Are you
okay? The existing literature in labor economics is really focused on workers' side characteristics, in which and consequently you would not see things like market structure of the labor market.
Well, and let's talk about that for a second. And I want to explore that a little bit, because you at times have voiced eloquent critiques of the way some economics is practiced. When we talk about people concentrating on the characteristics of workers instead of what's happening with employers, what are the kinds of things they're looking at?
Well, the big one is the supposed skills gap. So the idea is that the reason why you can't get a job is because you don't have the right skills for the jobs that are currently on offer. And I think we had plenty of evidence before now that the skills gap just doesn't work as an explanation for what's wrong with the labor market. But this paper and the general idea that the problem might rather be that there are too few employers hiring or that there's market power on the employer side, I think adds further fuel to that fire. I mean, it really is long past time to stop talking about worker skills and the idea of a skills gap, because it just isn't anything about workers that explains why it's hard to find a job
Well,
and why it's hard to get a raise.
yeah, and my reaction to the skills gap argument has always been, I don't know, maybe twofold. One is you'd think there would be more unfilled positions together with more people unable to find work if it were a skills gap problem. But the other is that it seems to me, whether consciously or unconsciously, that somehow blaming workers for some perceived deficiency on their part shifts attention away from the position of employers in this economy and whether in fact they may have too much of an advantage. Now, I don't know if that bias is conscious or unconscious. I don't know if it's ideological or just the result of people's training and orientation, but am I unfair in the way I look at it?
No, I think you're absolutely right as to the latter point. I would go so far as to say economics has a built-in ideological bias that basically the system works. So if there's some problem with the economy, say wage stagnation, that must be as a result of individual decisions and individual deficiencies. And consequently, some sort of large-scale market failure that isn't the result of bad decisions is sort of ruled out ex ante. And I think that's the case with labor market monopsony. I think the skills gap is a purported construct that explained rising inequality or labor market outcomes that were seen to be inadequate, was sort of invented as an ideology that created a context in which you could blame.
In which you could blame employees, right? And I suppose it's a short road from, if you're so wedded to the idea that the market works, it's a short road from thinking of people as bad inputs. They're not interacting with the market the way they should be, to thinking of it as being a character defect on their part, and therefore we don't really need to help these people.
Right, right. I mean, the whole reason why you would want to blame the victim is to excuse yourself.
Right. Now, let's talk a little bit, though, about if, in fact, what you found is true, and it seems to be incontrovertible, that there are highly concentrated labor markets in a large percentage of geographies in this country, then it kind of points to solutions that people might not. Well, let me back up a second. What kind of solution does it point to? Start there.
The focus of our work in this paper, and I think probably going forward, at least for me, is going to be on antitrust policy in particular. That is, we used to have a very robust policy that was entirely devoted to ensuring that power was equitably distributed in the economy, and starting in the late 70s, we sort of systematically went about dismantling that policy to the point that we found, excuse after excuse for allowing concentrations of power and assuming that such concentrations of power can't possibly be harmful, or that if they are harmful, then there's offsetting benefits. And this policy retreated drastically from what it had been doing in the post-war era to what it is doing now. And I think this has gotten a lot of attention in the wider world, as it's obvious that market concentration has risen in product markets, and usually that is defined by industries. So I think The Economist did an article a couple of a year or so ago, maybe a little more, that just showed the extent to which concentration in different industries has risen. And that is the mode of analysis that the antitrust agencies have typically taken, and they have more or less neglected labor markets. So I think that's undoubtedly true. The other thing is that it's not just a matter of the concentration of power as measured either by market concentration in the product market or market concentration in the labor market, but also the sorts of things you can get away with doing that have now become much more, or the antitrust regime has become much more permissive. So, for example, reclassifying workers as independent contractors, and thus that enables, in general, the former employer to cut their wages and otherwise remove worker protections. That is, to my mind, very clearly an exercise of monopsony power, and one that would have exposed them in the past potentially to antitrust liability as well as to labor law liability. And there are many ways in which now what would have been an antitrust violation is not considered an antitrust violation, and thus it makes it a better idea for employers to make use of that strategy, which is inherently exploitative. So when you say what can be done about this, it's basically the U.S. antitrust policy hasn't actually broken up a trust in a really long time. I mean, we did it to AT&T in 1984, culminating in 1984. They tried to do it with Microsoft in the late 90s and early 2000s, and the government failed in doing that. Though it's arguable that lawsuit still had a pretty profound effect on that sector. But the whole idea that you would deconstruct existing agglomerations of powerful corporations, and moreover that you might do so because of the monopsony power that they exercise over the labor market, both of those would be severe departures from the way that antitrust policy has recently been conducted. And I think it's time to start talking about major changes in that policy area.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I guess I would add to that note that you also have the issue of monopoly / monopsony, and monopsony, for those who don't know, being domination over the purchasing power. In this case of labor, first of all, you have people who violate on both ends. The Silicon Valley tech companies arguably have monopolistic power, particularly when they collaborate, and have also been accused of collaborating in the labor market in the Silicon Valley itself illegally. In fact, I think there have been fines levied for that. But you also have the issue of when a monopsony or monopoly exists at the local level. I mean, we think of antitrust normally. Antitrust policy is existing on the national level, but what you're talking about here are, for example, I don't know, Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut might have dominance over the labor market there. I don't know if it does, but just picking an example. So it would be a matter, they might be able to, in effect, set wages for that entire area. You'd have to be willing to address a kind of antitrust problem in localized markets as well, wouldn't you?
Yes, and in the past, antitrust policy has done that. In fact, when it did try to do that, and when it succeeded in doing that in the 50s and 60s, those are considered the kind of canonical examples of overuse of antitrust policy, of over-aggressive policy. One famous case, Vaughn's Grocery, was about the merger of two grocery stores in Los Angeles, or two small grocery store chains in Los Angeles, as being, how could they possibly care about this pissant little deal? And so that kind of, because it has a quote unquote bad reputation in antitrust, consequently the pendulum has just swung drastically in the other direction. The other point I would want to make about this, bringing up a company like Electric Boat, or in general the possibility that a dominant firm might exercise monopsony power in a local labor market. I am of the opinion that antitrust policy should be used to address that issue. But I would also point out that the whole reason why we have labor regulations over and above general regulations on the state of competition and the balance of power in the economy contained in antitrust, is that the labor relationship is thought to be, and was historically thought to be, inherently an unequal one, and consequently workers needed greater protection under labor law than was sort of generally available. The idea of the antitrust laws being they set a minimum baseline for the exercise of market power in the economy, and then in certain other sectors or in the labor market, you might have a more onerous regulatory regime. Like, for instance, in labor, we have a minimum wage. There's no equivalent sort of maximum price in antitrust. But the idea is that workers can be exploited much more just because of the nature of the labor relationship as one of unequal parties. But the point is, we have allowed our labor law regime also to slide into decrepitude, namely through the overuse of the independent contractor classification. So all of the protections that exist under labor law are not available if you can succeed in pushing your workers outside the wall of your firm. And increasingly, courts and legislatures and policy in general has been permissive of firms that do that as a way of exercising monopsony power over their workers. So I think when it comes to restoring competition to the labor market and ensuring that workers get raises in the future, it's required to basically bring both policy apparatuses to bear. One, antitrust, in order to push back on the power that firms extend outside the walls of their firm, and then the other, labor law, to make sure that workers who are inside the walls of their firm are treated equitably. And I guess the way I would put it is that we need to create a penalty on firms who push workers outside the walls. That means that they can no longer exercise control over those workers. That would be the case if we had a robust antitrust regime that took the labor market seriously. The way in the status quo, if they succeed in reclassification as independent contractors, then basically all bets are off and they can do whatever they want to their workers.
And unfortunately, we're going to have to cut it there, but I would only add very briefly that we could also use a strong labor movement as a counterweight.
Right.
Unfortunately, we will have to leave it there, but very important paper, very important conversation. I'm glad you're on it. Our guest is Marshall Steinbaum. He is the research director and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. So Marshall, thanks as always for the great work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Very glad to be here.
And